This is the Best Defense Survival Roundtable. I'm Michael Bain, and joining me during the course of this COVID-19 emergency is Mike Seeklander, Michael Janich, Rob Pincus, and Dr. William April. And this week, guys, this is our 6th, 7th week of doing this, and it seems to me that this is the week we should be celebrating, because all across the country we're seeing death rates and infection rates dropping. We're seeing recovery rates soaring. Hospitals are, at this point, almost empty, except outside maybe the New York area. Ventilators, different governors are giving ventilators to other governors, to other mayors. None of that high-end hockey stick, everyone is going to die, happened. But it seems to me, gentlemen, that we're not celebrating. In fact, it seems to me that we're pretty much where we are on week one. Mr. Janich, in our team that we've worked together over all these years, I, of course, am the voice of paranoia. You have always been the voice of moderation and reason. Mike, what the hell's going on out there?
I think you're exactly right as far as kind of where we are with things. We're kind of at that point of, in many ways, the end of normal human tolerance as far as disruption of lifestyle and all that kind of thing. And it's also one of those things where, again, people are kind of assessing it and saying, okay, how bad is this? How is it affecting me? We're being inundated by information, so people are trying to sort through all that and figure out what really is going on. And, of course, none of us really know that. So you're trying to make the best educated decisions you can, and you're also trying to weigh the risks to say, you know what if I went back to my normal? What would happen? And what if everyone else did that? What would happen? And the problem is we don't know for a couple of weeks. There's that lag time where it's like we say at this point, hey, we've done all this stuff and it wasn't that bad, so let's get on with our lives. That's the point of danger. You know, we simply don't know. We've never had any experience like this to draw from.
Mr. Pincus, you're ping-ponging back and forth across the country. So you're, in essence, you're our eyes out there in the field back and forth across the country. Why aren't we celebrating the successes we've had against this virus?
There's still people dying. I think it's natural, human behavior to, as much as we're anxious to get back to work, and as many people as there are on various levels of thinking it's time to go back to work and time to get back to at least some new normal, there's also still people in the hospital. There's also still people dying. And certainly there are still a lot of people who are genuinely concerned all the way to genuinely afraid of reopening and going back out. So it's definitely a little early to be I see some people, I made a few kind of jokes. I made a little video yesterday. Yesterday was my actual 24 hours in isolated quarantine for the first time since this started. I went from like 6 o'clock on Tuesday until just after 6 o'clock on Wednesday, isolated in a house, no toddler Pincus, no visitors, didn't leave the house. And I made a little video kind of joking about it where, I could look out my window and look over the balcony and see what appears to be business is normal. Hundreds of people going into the grocery store, people driving around, people on bikes, people walking their dogs, some number of them wearing a mask, but it kind of looks normal. And I actually got some flack in the comments for joking at a time like this. So there is a sensitivity to the fact that this is still going on, combined with the logical realization that it's time to move back into normal life. And then you got all the politics on top of it. So it's celebration is probably a little early for that.
Mr. Seeklander, in Tulsa, especially with your law enforcement contacts, they've got to be looking at more and more people who have reached the fed up point. What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Well, I'm hearing and seeing just that. Like last week, we mentioned the fact that they're definitively, everyone I've asked is definitively saying that, domestics and, heated arguments are up. I think some of the mental related calls that they're going to are probably up as well from what I'm hearing. But, here's the interesting opposite side of that is I think the normal people, the people that don't typically have domestics, the people that don't have a lot of mental issues going on, are starting to sizzle a little bit. I'll give you a great example. I know of a couple local academies, one that I train at. I don't know if you can see on camera. I train individually with my coach. You know, we follow procedures. He's quarantined, I'm quarantined, but I still train every once in a while with him and one other guy, and caught an elbow and a knee. Anyways, the point is, he is to the point where he's said, I'm just going to open up. It's time for me to open up. And I think a lot of people have literally reached the end of their ropes where they're saying, I have got to do something or I'm going to lose my life's work. And that's going to cause, or it seems to be causing a lot of normal folks to say, I have to do this. My bank account and the things that matter to me are saying, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose something I've worked for. And you know, once again, from my perspective, I'm not sure what the audience is getting or receiving. I personally haven't had any help. I'm not sure where the delay in the check is and this and that, the stimulus checks, but you know, I've been on my own. I know a lot of people that I've talked to are on their own as well. So I think that's part of the craziness maybe we feel in the air. People are chomping at the bit to figure out what they need to do, yet they still want to be safe. I think they get this thing is serious, you know?
Dr. April, we were talking before you went on the air. You were mentioning that there in New Orleans, you've got a ping pong game between your mayor and your governor. And I'm seeing that very similar in Colorado. In the county I live in, you know, the health officials here are very conservative, if you will. And even though tomorrow or this week we're supposed to be opening back up, that has not happened yet. And so it seems to me that people now are getting what amounts to a staggeringly mixed message, which is one person saying, let's open up, the next person saying, we're all going to die. In New Orleans, what's going on?
Well, it doesn't help when the messages seem to conflict. And I think it can lead some people to just throw their hands up in the air and say, they don't know what they're doing either, so I'm just going to decide. You know, it seems that people are embracing a sort of civil disobedience aspect to this, as their limit for taking the government at its word has just been reached. I think, though, that we can help a little bit by being a little bit neater about the language. I don't think anybody here is thinking about going back, meaning just winding back the clock. I think what we're talking about is going forward, where we're going to bring some of the best practices of quarantine and lockdown forward into a reopening. And we're going to reopen into a new thing, into a new way that will eventually evolve to something closer like going back. But I think when we stop using the phrase go back, it helps people not be painted as blithely ignoring what we've been through and saying, I'm just going to pretend this never happened. And I think we owe it to our audience to be a little neater about that.
Mr. Janet, do you want to expand on that a little bit? That seems like a topic that you and I have discussed a bunch.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, what it comes down to, as we've talked about, you know, in previous weeks here, is there's so many regional differences. You know, everyone is in a little bit different situation. And the thought process of somebody who is in New York versus somebody who's in a rural area or something like that, again, you have to kind of look at what risks you actually face, kind of what's going on in your area. And it really ends up becoming, we look at it as a total problem, which we have to look at it in totality, but at the same time, how it affects us, I think, ends up becoming much more of a regional problem and certainly more of an individual thing as far as individual risks, you know. And that's one of the things, even with, as things start to open up and we're wrestling with all this stuff about, well, the mayor says this, the governor says this, these people decide that they want to open up their businesses, these people are rebelling. You have all these dynamics going on and everything. As we're trying to sort through all that stuff, if you're, you know, elderly and you have a respiratory issue, you shouldn't be going outside. I mean, it's that simple. You still have to think for yourself.
Exactly. Mr. Pincus, Rob, it seems to me that every one of us here has said, and I pretty much follow us on most of the social media, so I know kind of what we're saying when we're offline here. I believe everything we've said, we preface it by saying these are the cautions that we take. You know, I wear a mask whenever I'm inside anywhere else, in N95 respirator. I maintain that distance, but people are not necessarily hearing that anymore. Rob?
Yeah, they're not. Unfortunately, I did a whole video that I put out this week on the face covers versus the N95s versus the full P100. You know, and it was something that we did on this show. I've done it on other shows. I've done videos on it, but most of them are a month or so ago, before the issue of face covers became so political. So again, as I said in my last comment, I'm really frustrated by, and I think that many people are frustrated by the politicization of the common sense response. You know, like Janice just said, we have to find our own individual responses. You know, we've all talked about this jurisdictional issue. You brought up what's going on in Tennessee. Of course, it's playing out very acutely in Dallas, where now this woman is trying to open her salon. She has opened her salon. There's a judge involved. The governor's apparently on her side. The city and county in Dallas don't want her open. And I mean, it reminds me, I said earlier today on another show, we're going to have the National Guard or the Texas, Department of Public Safety, the Texas Rangers escorting customers in between the local police, trying to stop customers from going in. And I just left Colorado. Colorado's got the same kind of thing going on, where you've got a Democrat governor, for example, saying people should have concealed carry permits and permits should be expired, or the expiration date should be extended. And you've got some Republican leaders in counties saying, no, we're not going to issue permits and we're not extending expirations. It's kind of crazy times in some ways. And it all comes down to some of us, even that watch this show, even that watched our shows, even those amongst us who train and listen to our individual feeds, we're probably way too complacent and way too trusting of the status quo, and we're seeing it fall apart all around us. So it all comes back to individually making smart choices. I'm using a lot of sanitizer, and I'm wearing a face cover in public, and I'm not doing either one of them because the government says so. I'm doing it because of the complete picture that I believe that I'm living in says those are good practices for me and for the communities I'm moving around in.
Dr. April, do you want to add to that just a little bit? Because I think that's part of where this tension is we can talk about doing the correct things, and we can talk about it being important for us to continue the distancing, to mask in interior spaces, things like that. But there's a political rift cutting across this country right now, and it is getting wider pretty much by the hour.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to recognize that we in our actions, we want to be responsive. We want to take in information and process that information and make a judgment based on our own, best thinking and our own situation and perspective. We don't want to be reactive. A reactive is just, well, someone told me to do it, therefore I will not do it. Or, someone told me not to, therefore I will. Those are both pretty crazy. And so I think it's harder to say, I need to sit down and sift through some of this data myself and decide for myself at my own risk. That takes a lot of maturity and a lot of ownership of the problem, and especially how the problem is going to impact us personally. And frankly, those are things most people don't enjoy. It's much easier to pass the blame for our actions one way or another onto someone else. And I think that time has passed. I think it's time to be adult about this whole thing.
Mr. Seeklander, have you lost any friends because of this quarantine or in the political fray that has developed around the quarantine? Right, do you have any friends, number one?
I don't have any friends.
Have you actually lost any?
To be very honest, as you all know, my personality, I tend to stay pretty low profile on politics, except for the extreme stuff. And I also maybe challenge what we're seeing to an extent on the news. I don't know. I think there's a rift in terms of some of the power hungry people that are trying to play and spin this. But I think if you had a way to connect directly to every single human in the U.S., let's just say U.S. for now, and check their pulse, they'd pretty much all feel the same way. They're irritated because they're running out of money. They want to open their business up. They're scared to go back to work. Some of them have been mandated to go back to work, and they're not sure if they should or if they should put their family first. But they all generally just want life to evolve into whatever it's going to become. I think that the politicians and the power plays and some of the folks spinning things they're going to be a big part of the problem in the coming future. In terms of me, though, I mean, I hate to say it, I had some online presence before. I upped my online presence. I've probably been in front of more people on live Facebooks and videos, just teaching and not talking about politics or really even the virus to an extent, but teaching the things that I know how to do, just because that's what I'm good at. You know, I'm not going to do a video on some medical stuff or masks, because that's not my expertise. So I've been kind of focused on what I think I'm good at, and trying to be helpful there, because I think those are subjects that keep people entertained and maybe educate and teach them things. When right now maybe they have time to listen to that material, where before they were too busy with work to pay attention to it. So I have a few new friends, Mike.
It's even better then. Mr. Janich, let me just throw that out there. But, and I know coming from me, this probably sounds a little extreme. For the most part, people are responsible. If you look at before the quarantine, one of the things that you saw was all of a sudden people were staying home. They weren't going out to restaurants. And that started happening about 2 weeks prior to anybody saying, quarantine, we're going to lock you in, safer at home, all those things. And you see that internationally. I mean, we talk about Sweden without a lockdown, but the Swedish people stayed home. And you saw the same thing in the United States. I think sometimes that our politicians underestimate the responsibility and the intelligence of the American people.
I think they underestimate it, and they also don't encourage it. Because again, as being politicians, they want to be in charge, versus the idea of saying, look, you're all pretty smart. Why don't you just use the intelligence you have and make smart decisions? And if you do, it's going to serve you well. If you don't, then you're going to bear you're going to reap the benefits or the negative aspects of that as well. You know, we talk about Sweden. You brought it up again. One of the things that I was curious about this week was, you know, last week we talked about, they basically decided, you know what, we're going to essentially do what everyone is tempted to do now here in the U.S. We're just going to kind of let things go back to normal. You know, businesses are going to reopen, all that kind of stuff. So I was kind of curious where they're at right now. And what's interesting is, as far as number of COVID deaths in the world, they're number 14 as far as countries. It puts them right behind Canada, but their population is 1/4 that of Canada. So when you start looking at comparing population to number of deaths, you know, by doing what they're doing, they're essentially accelerating kind of the natural progression of what this thing is all about. And that, you know, we've talked about elephants in the room and all that kind of stuff. The bottom line is this disease is killing people. And one of the things that we have always done, we try to be sensitive, we try to be understanding, but we also try to be realistic. And when you look at things and you say, okay, cool, I'm going to do things that are going to expose me to a potentially deadly disease. The more people who expose themselves to a potentially deadly disease, the more people who are going to die. And that becomes simply a statistical progression that a lot of people haven't wrapped their heads around yet. They realize that it's there, but they haven't really done the math as far as how that's going to progress. And that's one of those things where if we had the crystal ball and we could say, okay, a year from now, how many total people will have died from this? And then we jump in the time machine, we come back to today, and we say, okay, what would I do differently if I knew that now? That becomes the challenge. Everyone wants to go back to normal, but they don't know what, you know, what the aftermath is going to be.
It's absolutely true. In the absence of crystal balls, there's not much we can do. You know, the nature
can I add one thing that Mr. Bain?
Please.
Well, I want to bring out the what I think is a critical thing that we didn't realize when all this started is there are some businesses and entities that can very easily modify and come back to somewhat normal. And there are some, for example, I just got a list of rules from my local MMA BJJ coach. He just texted to me that this could kill their business because there's no such thing as social distancing when you're talking about grappling or even doing some of the stuff that Mike Janich does or gym related. When you're in close contact, breathing and sweating on one another, you can't do it without physical contact. So I think that's one of the things maybe we didn't think about was there are some businesses that will evolve and be okay, and there are some that if they don't accept the fact that this thing might travel and people may get sick, are going to be crushed. They're literally not going to exist, and I don't see that happening. I see them choosing to exist, with an acceptance of the risks.
Yeah, part of a new way forward means that when you do see, people keep talking lately about a second wave, or numbering them seems kind of silly, but when people do see a return to an infectious process, you're going to see clusters in businesses like a gym, where the personal contact is part of the game. And so we have to adjust our tolerance for seeing some future reinfection rate without panicking and thinking the process itself is flawed and that we need to go back to a lockdown. This isn't prevention, this is mitigation.
Important point, Rob. You're shaking your head,
actually,
yes.
Yeah, I was on a call this morning with one of the other owners of our gym in Ohio, which is not just a gym, but it's also a defensive training center. And what we're doing is we're going to open up again later this week for some expanded on-site stuff. They're doing a bunch of distance education, stuff like that. We're moving some of the equipment around. We have big bay doors that can be open. We have a big parking lot space to use. It's going to be relatively easy for most of our activities, but there's a big grappling program there and also a Krav Maga program that does a lot of hands-on stuff. And what we're doing is we're investing in grappling dummies to facilitate a lot of that. And we're just going to have some really strict sanitizing and personal protection coatings and coverings. At the end of the day, people are going to be breathing on people. People are going to be sweating on people, but we can still take steps to mitigate. In my world, in defensive shooting firearms training world, I was talking to someone, who does concealed carry at the lowest level, right? Like literally people who've never touched a gun before. One of the really important things we have to acknowledge is if I'm running a qualification for a police department, I can stand 20 feet away, put the students 8-10 feet away from each other and call the commands on a bullhorn or whatever. But if I'm working with a student that's never picked up a live gun before, there's been a lot of talk about all these new first-time gun owners, I've got to be within arm's reach. That's the only safe place to be when that new person picks up the gun. I've got to be able to control them, control the gun, take the gun if I need to, control their body. And what that means is the local instructor, the range guy, the local guy that's doing the yeoman's work in the firearms training world needs to be prepared to wear a face shield, to wear gloves, to have clothes, an outer garment layer that they're going to strip off and they're going to get rid of at the end of the class. But they need to be able to cycle in close proximity to all of those new shooters while the new shooters might be physically distanced from one another. And if we don't accept that reality of how to accept risk, find where the risks are, and then mitigate them, potentially you're going to have a brand new gun owner who has some tragic accident on the range and kills another brand new gun owner or the person that's watching from behind because the instructor wasn't doing their fundamental job because the instructor was too worried about following a physical distancing rule. So it really does come down to critical thinking and then risk mitigation, or we just don't do that activity for a while. And I know a lot of people are going to choose that last option because that's always an option of freedom. It's just don't do it for now.
But yet here's the one big question that hangs over all this. What is the virus? If you look at the serology reports out of California, New York, and Florida, which are very diverse environments, you see the percentage of the population that has been infected with the COVID-19 virus is huge. 10x, 15x, 25x what anybody expected, which means that yes, it's a scary virus, and yes, it kills people, but ultimately you come down to a set of numbers. And if that set of numbers says that the lethality of disease is falling at 0.1 rather than 1.0, then the level of mitigation that you need is drastically smaller. The level of mitigation starts approaching a severe flu season, not an average flu season, or certainly the Hong Kong flu, which we saw in 1968. In the absence of that number, it's hard to go. It's hard for me to say, how do we go forward with this? Mr. Sieklander?
I'm not exactly sure how we do it specifically, and I don't think anybody knows that, and I don't think anybody needs to try to solve that problem right away. I just think, Rob just mentioned critical thinking. I think that's it. I think people are going to have to literally look at their circumstance and situation, piecemeal, bit by bit. I can tell you, my BJJ coach, he says, I'm going to open until I'm told otherwise, and he's doing that because he's still paying rent, he's still paying electricity, and we're talking the survival of his academy that he spent his last 15 to 20 years building. I get that. I mean, I've started a defensive handgun online program, but I already had a big online presence anyways, which is good. But I just, I agree with the points Rob made, and I think a lot of people are going to just have to make decisions bit by bit, that we're going to have to approach decision by decision. But one of the things that I would encourage people to do is let's not panic. Let's not create drama in our own mind. Let's not worry about what could happen or what we can't control. Let's just look at today and figure out what we can do to best ourselves today. And then maybe, I know the positive thinking mentality or suggestions sometimes gets poo-pooed on because people are like, man, things are really bad. Well, guess what? They could be worse. We've talked about that since week number 1 or week number 2. If the fatality rate was what some of the people were saying back then or what it could be, this would totally change the game. We wouldn't be worried about opening up an MMA gym. We'd be wondering how to, deal with the bodies in the houses in the neighborhoods, So I think bit by bit, make smart, logical decisions.
That's absolute truth. I mean, this isn't Captain Trips. This isn't the Black Death in Constantinople. This isn't the Spanish flu, for that matter. Dr. April, thoughts there?
Well, I think that in the sense of, instead of thinking about moving back, going back, thinking about going forward, I said several weeks ago, and I still maintain, one of the goods that may come out of this is that we start taking the flu seriously. My vision of cold and flu season in America is that it's talked about on television. A certain percentage of people get flu shots, the rest of America doesn't, and we just move on. We tolerate the dozens of thousands of deaths from it. Well, what would happen if next year, with it fresh in our minds from COVID, everyone took flu season as an increased personal risk period and started wearing a mask and started increasing their hand hygiene and their personal distancing? We could really strike back against the flu. I don't think everything that comes out of this is going to be bad, and we've got to stop thinking about it as, I can't wait to go back to the good old days when I didn't have to think about any of this.
That's a very good point. If you look at what we're doing here, actually, we did Beth's Defense for 14, 15 years, where we all got together and did Best Defense. And what we have here is an ongoing production where we all get together, but we're not together. And again, based on the data that I've seen coming in on the number of views here, there's a lot of people who really appreciate essentially this new model. And I think in some ways, to me, whenever there's a time of change like this, you have an opportunity to look at the old ways that you did things with new eyes, because in a sense you're being forced to look at everything with new eyes. Mr. Janich?
That's exactly right. And, it's we're all products of our experience. In many cases, we're victims of our experience, but by making ourselves products of the experience, as Dr. April was saying, we look at it and we say, okay, let me not just blow all this stuff off and say, okay, I want to go back to the way things were. It's just like when we talk about self-defense, when we talk about any other kind of preparedness, when you have an experience where you say, you know what, my skills fell short or my equipment fell short, or, for whatever reason, I wasn't as prepared to deal with that contingency as I could have been. You don't just blow it off and say, well, it'll probably never happen again. I'm good to go. And I'm going to go back to, using a crappy holster or, not having empty hand skills or whatever it might have been that fell short. Instead, you'll step back and you look at it and say, okay, what do I need to do to change who I am, what resources I have, what my individual preparedness is, and how I approach things, so I'm better prepared next time. It may never happen. It may be that, that exact same situation never repeats itself, but there may be enough similar things, or it may be that whatever else you deal with in your life, you're now just better prepared to cope simply because you've been through some type of hardship. You've been through a challenge, and it's forced you to sit back and say, okay, how ready am I for this? And what do I need to do better? And that goes across the board. I mean, it's just like a lot of people are dealing with, the mental and emotional aspects of this. We've talked about the financial side and everything as well. And it may be something where, you have somebody who, say from the emotional side or the mental side, they've always thought, oh, meditation, that's a bunch of BS. I would never do anything like that. But now they may be in a situation where it's like, hey, I'm feeling anxiety. I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to sit in a room. I'm going to turn the lights down. I'm going to listen to a white noise machine or some, soothing music. And I'm just going to try to clear my head, and I'm going to try something that I've never tried before. And you realize, hey, wait a minute, here's a skill set that makes me a better person, makes me better prepared for everything else that I might have to deal with. We need to learn from it. So whatever it is, and again, however it affects us individually, try to look for those wins, try to look for those opportunities to make ourselves better.
Yeah, you sort of reminded me of a line out of Albert Camus' The Plague, where after this plague ended in the city in the 1700s, the line that Camus used was that the people came out, the bells were ringing, the church bells were ringing, people were in the street celebrating because the great forgetting had not begun. I thought that was a good line. His point being that at that moment, everybody remembered the hell that they had been through, but then they would sort of immediately begin forgetting. And of course, his point, if those of you are familiar with the book, they used to teach it in high school. They don't teach things like that in high school anymore. But that the doctor knew what none of the rest of them knew, which is that the plague never went away. And that at some point in the future, another great line, it would, to the terror and enlightenment of mankind, send forth its rats to die in a happy city. How do we avoid the great forgetting, Dr. April?
Well, I think, there's another line. There's a historian named Antonio Gramsci who once said that a crisis consists of an old that is dying and a new that isn't yet born. And I think that's pretty important because it implies action on both ends. We have to accept that the old, the time that we never had to think about any of this, is dying and well on its way to being dead. And we have to start thinking about how do we midwife the process of birthing something new, something that isn't just an instinct to turn and run backwards into the past, but the notion that we have to create something that works given the current parameters. And that's the hardest part, where you see it break down politically. I'll see so many people, sadly, on the right, where I think most of us would find ourselves, whose instinct is, let's just run back to the good old days. That's ridiculous. And it makes us easy to belittle, frankly.
That's totally true. And not to mention the fact that there's no such thing as the good old days.
Nostalgia just isn't what it used to be.
That's right. Rob, but still, as we go forward, Mr. Pincus, for especially people with families, it's easy for me. I got a dog and a cat and some birds, and I live in a bunker up in the mountains. But Rob, you're there with toddler Pincus. It's harder for people, especially with young children, to say, okay, the world is changing, and now we have to change everything. All the things that we took for granted, those operating systems are no longer valid. How do you start there, Rob?
It's interesting. It's I still have my parents, and I have a granddaughter, and I have the older daughter in Nashville. We're actually going to see them. We'll be with them, my older daughter and my granddaughter, tomorrow. I've got my younger daughter here with me, and it is it's occurred to me, if it weren't for all the connections and everything else, I would just go down to Silverton and hang out in the mountains for 2 months in lockdown, and wouldn't be the end of the world by any stretch for me. But, I've got connections. I've got family members to take care of and worry about. I've got, luckily my brother is in New Jersey. He's been getting supplies for my mom and my stepdad there, because they shouldn't be out, especially in New Jersey, the way things have been. So I think there's this extension. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's got his family down in Florida, and this is about the time of year that they make their way back up north for the summer up north, and they're trying to figure out if it's safer to drive or fly or what's going to expose them to less. And I said, the only way you're going to keep them isolated is rent a RV, drive down to Florida, put them in the RV, and drive back up without them having to go to a rest stop or a restaurant or anything else on the way back. But that really begs the question, when they get back to North Georgia, are they actually going to isolate? Are they not going to go to restaurants? Are they not going to go to Walgreens? Are they not going to go see their local doctors? Because that's, at some point, we have to find ways for everyone in our family to move forward. One of these face covers, I've had several attempts, but this is one that's actually manufactured by a company in Italy, and it fits toddler Pincus's little, almost 5-year-old face perfectly. But it was much harder to find an adequate face cover for her with the toddler fidgeting and playing and the hair and everything else that actually was secure enough that it was at least meeting the performance level of what I would expect for myself. So there is an extension that we all have to taking care of those around us, and it complicates things, but it doesn't make it overwhelming. It's not impossible to deal with, but it must be dealt with. One other thing that a couple of the comments you guys have made and midwifing that Dr. April said really made me think of is I've had to reevaluate my own beliefs on habit formation and repetition and kind of non-cognitive processing to create subconscious responses, or automated responses in life, because I'm seeing it happen all around me so fast, so much faster than sort of the cliches, 10,000 days to become an expert, things like that. Our country, a lot of people are becoming pretty accustomed to subconsciously social distancing, to subconsciously, thinking about putting the mask on. I see people's reaction when they get out of the car and they realize their mask is on their neck as they get ready to go into the store. Or they don't have their mask. They reach for it and they have to go back to the car, or they go into their purse or whatever. So I think very quickly I'm seeing our culture, our society form new habits, and we're flexible. We're an adaptable people, and we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to have to help our family and friends adapt as well, and encourage them to. Which, again, to the point we've all made, the government's not really encouraging us to. They're threatening us what happens if we don't. We need to get back to normal. And I know that that's not what we're supposed to be saying, but I'm really talking about this new normal. But when I say back to normal, I don't think we're going back to what it was 6 months ago, because 6 months ago we were ignorant in many ways and complacent in many ways. I think we need to go forward into this new normal, but that means embracing the fact that it is a new normal, and that's hard for a lot of people to do, even in our verbiage, and I'm catching myself to it, obviously.
Oh, well, we do have to separate out the fact that there are punitive governors. Governor Newsom in California saying, okay, we're closing all the parks and beaches. Why? Because we can. Because I'm the Prince of California. But Mr. Seeklander, Mike, you've got older kids. So you're basically dealing with a different challenge. You've got older kids in the house with you. And I'm not saying these are your kids, but I recall when I was their age, I was a bit stubborn, conceivably more stubborn than I am now. I'm not sure, but so you've got challenges there that we don't have here. How are you dealing with those challenges?
Yeah, good question. Before I talk about the kids, just in addition to you talking about governor shutting things down, uniquely, one of the things that I didn't mention that is affecting me, even with my defensive handgun online course, which it's a surprisingly good method of instruction. It really works, other than the fact that I can't touch people, which is probably good for now. But a lot of people are emailing me and saying, hey, Mike, I want to sign up for this thing, but all the local ranges are closed down, and they've shut these local ranges down, and they've literally physically kicked people off the ranges. They had in near Massachusetts, in one of the ranges I go to, the police were there and removed people from some of these individual members. And this is a place that has a key card and 30 bays. So theoretically, you could easily social distance. Guess what, folks? They shut the whole thing down. And that could be an issue in the future. That's something we need to keep an eye on, I think. But in terms of the kids, to be honest with you, we had structure in place beforehand. The three we have in the home are generally respectful. They know what happens when they're not respectful. They also understood the fact that we're doing this for our safety. We have these regular discussions. Matter of fact, our system is a little shaky today in terms of their responsibilities, so we're going to have a family discussion as soon as we're off here. And, you know, realistically, other than missing their chore here and there, they're good kids. So I'm just lucky in that. I mean, we haven't really had anyone that's been trying to sneak out. As a matter of fact, my wife went out for the first time on her own to the store the other day and mentioned to my daughter, hey, you want to go in with me and get this or whatever else? And the teenage daughter said, man, I don't know if I really want to go in and be, you know, so they've kind of, I don't know if they morph or they've evolved, but they've been assimilated maybe into this whole thing, and they get it. They can't wait to get out at the same time. You know, it's weird. Kids that would never say, I want to be in school are saying, I wish we were in school. So that's, man, who would have guessed that, right?
Dr. April?
I think it's important that Mike's point is very well taken. And it calls on us to remember that culture is a glacier, not a mountain. It's moving slowly, but it's moving. I mean, think about how much social norms have changed. When World War II ended, half of Americans smoked. You could smoke thoughtlessly. You could light up and smoke wherever you were, and anybody that had a problem with it was wrong. Well, that's completely inverted in the lifetimes of people who are still alive. Now, even smokers have recognized that it's incumbent on them to find out where and when it's okay to smoke. That's the movement of something that was unexplored in their minds to something that they realize this is my responsibility to check out. You know, that's very much a model for the kind of changes we're talking about.
Mr. Janich?
I think Rob's comment as far as like how quickly people adapt, I think is very interesting. And it's also one of those things, again, when you look at something like smoking, you look at really kind of public behavior. When we try to develop a skill, when we try to do something, and it's a conscious effort, and we're the only ones doing it, so we're kind of inside our own heads as we do that, it requires a lot more effort. When everything is happening around us kind of in concert, where we're all dealing with the same thing at the same time, it affects all of us. And we're constantly reminded by it. And it's one of those things where it's such a pervasive issue that, you know, we see our kids changing, we see our spouses changing, we see everybody dealing with it in their own way. So we're constantly getting these reminders that, you know, hey, we're all dealing with this. And in some cases, you may look at somebody and say, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to model that behavior. In other cases, you look at it and you say, hey, I think that guy's an idiot. I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to stay away from him. But what's interesting about this is you're really kind of inundated by the problem, and you're constantly getting stimuli from all over the place, just saying, okay, this is how the world is dealing with this. And I think that's one of the things that really accelerates that change, because we never stop thinking about it. It's a constant training and learning process and a constant adaptation process.
Well, I come back to, and it is an issue that's on my mind, is I do believe that all that aside, there is an encroachment on personal liberties, on constitutionally protected liberties going on now. William? Dr. April?
That's exactly right. It's a process of habituation, and some of the things we can get habituated to are quite bad. It is interesting to me that the distinction between rights and privileges seems to be lost. I saw somebody posted somewhere the other day, if it can be taken away and restored and taken away and restored, it's not a right, it's a privilege. And so I think people getting used to their rights being negotiable, that's a scary kind of habituation, and that's one we want to push back against.
I tend to agree very much. It's that nibbling away at the rights, but partly, and I wanted to address this to Rob, Mr. Pincus. What we're seeing is the fruits of the culture of safety. there's always that standard joke that said all of us should be dead because we grew up drinking out of the hose, and we were playing in parks with swings that didn't have nets to catch us if we fell. What we've seen is in the last 20 years an evolution of an almost obsessive culture of safety, and not to demean safety, but we've kind of stepped over the brink to it of OMG, if there's anything in the world that can happen to us, could the government please step in and put a sorbethane pad on it? Rob?
Well, the government or parents or friends or ourselves, right? Like, how dare you ride a motorcycle without a helmet, kind of stuff. Like, freedom isn't safe. It's one of my favorite, simplest lines. It's not an argument or discussion ender, but it is a cut to the bottom line when I'm talking to people who are interested in control.
He may be slipping away from us
or
here.
any of these other issues.
There you go.
We can only save one life. Well, no, not if we can only save one life, because it's not worth.
Okay, Rob, we're losing you a little bit here, Rob.
Am I there? Have you got me? There we go. It's several the back? Am I back?
Yes, you're back now.
Okay, sorry about that. So this idea of safety third came from Mike Rowe, articulated this really well. And it turns out something I've been talking about for over a decade in our instructor development program. But this very eloquent way of saying it, safety third. We can't pretend that safety is first in a big sign on the lie, right? Making refrigerators at that factory is the number one concern. As a process of making refrigerators, they have to identify the risks to the workers in that environment, and then they have to mitigate those risks. So safety is really the third step, and we've lost sight of that in our country. We want to.
Mr. Janich, I think you may have a little better connection than Rob. You want to, Rob, hang on a second. We'll come back to you. Mike, you want to touch?
We want to find the new normal.
The internet isn't what it's cracked up to be.
No. There's a line that we've all heard that's ships are safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships are for. We strike a balance between liberty and risk at all times. I remember having a conversation when I worked at a university with one of the risk management lawyers, and he said, there is no zero risk model to running a university. He said, the only way to have a zero risk university is to close it down. And so, we're striking, always a balance with the benefits of liberty and some of the costs of liberty too. I don't think that's crazy to want to have that discussion. If, anything we do for the children, or if it saves even one life, those can be taken quite a bit too far. And I think people are getting a little sneak peek at that right now.
Mr. Janich, I think that is the case. I think what Rob was saying over the last 20 years, and especially maybe accelerating over the last 5 to 10 years, is the whole idea that somehow safety overrides every other factor in life. And as we spoke to in the best defense over all those years, if you want to guarantee a way that you will never be in an active shooter situation, for example, the best way to do that is stay in your bedroom. Because if you step out your front door, you are now accepting a level of risk in your life.
That's exactly right. And again, it goes back to the basics that we talk about all the time. And as you said, if you want to protect yourself from an active shooter, you don't go out, you don't go into crowds. We've talked about that as, in the best defense model, we would always talk about kind of worst, better, best. And when you would approach that best case scenario, what can I do to completely avoid this problem? Well, again, you stay at home in your house under a blanket with a flashlight, and that's it. I mean, that's as good as it gets. That's largely what everyone is doing right now, and we don't like it. We want to do all these other things, and as soon as we do all those other things, all those risks come rushing back with a new risk that we don't fully understand yet. So when you, what's interesting about it is it's a very, for me, it's a fascinating and disappointing time as well to watch our public officials and everything try to lead during crisis. We talk about lessons that we're supposed to be learning from this entire thing. That's one of the other things that I hope we don't forget is when you see people who are caught in a crisis and they're trying to make decisions, they're trying to articulate, we're doing this for this reason. In some cases, you may be completely inspired and have great confidence in the person because they say, hey, we're going to do A, B, and C for this reason. We've thought about it. This was our thought process, and this is, the course of action we're taking. You may sit back and say, wow, this is great. This guy has our best interest at heart. He's done the research. I'm all in. In other cases, you're going to have somebody who's doing something and you're saying, this guy's a moron. Why did I vote for him? I will never vote for him again. I don't have any faith in anything else that he does. And it's again, a very educational process, both positively and negatively. We talk about risks. It's also, risk is a very, very broad concept. It includes the risk of putting stupid people in charge.
Dr. April, it's hard to beat that, Mike. If you run for office, you have my vote.
That's
because
right.
I'm afraid of you.
Vote Mike. Don't put the stupid people in charge. It's a great motto. But it's going to be important. Across every sphere of life. If you think about it, the military has gone through several struggles in the post-Vietnam era about the value of force protection. If you deploy people forward and yet you keep in your mind the concept that the most important thing is that I don't get any of my soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines killed, well, then they can't do their actual job. In the law enforcement community, if officer survival is your number one concern, then you can't get out and enforce the law and crush crime. All of these things are a balance, and I think we run the risk because we're so scared of an invisible enemy. We run the risk of skewing that balance towards safety and away from everything else.
Mr. Seeklander, risk is a part of life. It's not correct to say, well, I'm at risk. The nature of living is risk, and not only that, in the end, you're actually going to lose, no matter what. We understand how the song ends. But would you say that it's important for people to think about risk not in a negative way, but in fact, in a positive way?
Absolutely. I'll mirror to an extent what Janet said in terms of us, and one of the things we talked about on the best defense for years in a lot of different episodes was, unless you decide to lock yourself in a steel ball, you may end up in a situation where you have to defend yourself, which is why self-defense skills are so important. But I actually, in terms of risk, I wanted to read what my coach just posted. And it's pretty interesting because he addresses the same things we're talking about here in terms of opening his MMA training facility. He said, number one, you need to understand that being in close proximity to another person increases your risk of exposure to COVID-19. So you need to accept, if you get on the mat with someone or even get within breathing distance, that increases your risk. Number two, if you or someone you live with is considered high risk, then you should not train. So while you may want to train or go to a restaurant or you're okay with the risk, you've got to also accept that same level of risk for the people you're going to take it back to and be around, and maybe take it back to and not know you are exposed or sick at all. And then number three says the most certain way to limit your exposure is not to train. It will be up to you as to how much exposure you feel comfortable with. And of course, he goes on and talks about symptoms and stuff like that. But that's the point, is like, in terms of mitigating this risk for this thing, as things theoretically start to reopen, what are you willing to risk individually? What are your personal parameters? And then more importantly, who could you bring it back to? Because you may affect someone that is high risk without even thinking about it. So I think it's like layered self-defense. It's the same thing with individual self-defense. Individual self-defense starts individually, but then again, wait a second, if I don't do my job and have the ability to defend myself, in this case, now I can't defend my family or anyone else, and am I willing to deal with that or not?
Mr. Pincus, hopefully you got the tinfoil hat readjusted and got a better connection to the internet here.
Yeah, I think so. It sounds clear. Hopefully you can hear me. I don't know how much of that safety third concept got out last time.
Could you reiterate a little of it? It kind of died off at the end. If you could come back and touch on that.
The idea is and this is something that we've been doing in our programs when we talk about the fundamental responsibility of an instructor is to balance risk and benefit. Right, that's our number one job when we're out there with live fire weapons. And to some extent, it's like, welcome to the party, JITS instructors. Welcome to the party, hairstylists. Like, yeah, you now have to balance life and death decisions in the way you operate your business. No one goes into running live fire classes without knowing that someone could die on their watch. And it's something that hopefully we're all reminding our students of as well. You might die here, not just on the waiver, but we say it. I take out my medical kit, whether it's an ankle kit or a bag, and I open it up and I say, here's the tourniquet. We might need to use it today. Now everyone's dealing with that in some more tangible way. The safety third idea is the way Mike Rowe, the Dirty Jobs guy, kind of one of the very interesting social commentator over the last 4 or 5 years, has really got a huge following. 5-6 years ago, he talked about this safety third idea, and the example he used was they started having accidents in the later seasons of Dirty Jobs, but the first many seasons they never had any accidents with the crew or the staff or when they were filming episodes. And he realized people were getting complacent and their eyes were sort of glazing over at okay, remember the number one thing here is safety, because the number one thing wasn't safety. The number one thing was making a TV show. And I think like a factory floor, when the sign on top of the factory floor, the big banner says safety is our number one concern, it's a lie, right? Making refrigerators is that factory's number one concern. And they have to identify the risks. That's the number two thing involved in the workers making refrigerators. And the number three is actually safety. Safety is third. And that's really what we're all having to learn to do with a new thing. And that new thing is the virus. And to Dr. April's point, it's not like viruses are new. It's not like washing your hands is a new idea. And certainly there are other places on the planet where wearing masks is a new idea. And we're going to be adopting some of those practices for the better. It's going to make us a healthier society. It's going to make us more aware of how our actions influence and affect our health. I think the issue of underlying issues and how clearly they've affected mortality when it comes to the coronavirus, maybe it's going to make people think about losing a few pounds or getting a little bit stronger or eating a little bit more healthy, or clearing up whatever respiratory issues they have. Maybe stop smoking. Whatever the thing is that's put them in a potentially higher risk situation. Some of that's not controllable, but some of it is. Hypertension, it's treatable, right? The things that get us there, we know what they are. So I do think that while safety third is definitely a mantra of mine, there are preventative steps we can take, which we do first before we reach crisis mode, before the worst case scenario.
Well, see, we're coming up on about an hour here. Mr. Seeklander, your closing thoughts, what to tell people as we're moving forward through this next week, next 7 days. What are we looking for? What do they need to know? What do they need to be thinking about?
I think right now, because of all the new thought processes, like, hey, should we reopen? Should I go there? Take things one step at a time. Take it one decision at a time. What are you willing to risk? What is that risk going to affect you? How is that risk going to affect others? And how could it affect the unknown? Try to foresee the future. We're getting more and more knowledgeable about this thing every day. So take it one step at a time. Don't stress. Don't worry about things that you can't control right now, right? Just worry about the individual things you can control. And by the way, we talked about 5 weeks ago, whatever, that little mini quiz. How did you do on your quiz? If you didn't do well on your quiz, it didn't have enough food, didn't have enough resources, and you still have the ability to strengthen your position, guess what? There might be a round two, and it might be some little mini bumps, or it might be a big bump, or it might be a new COVID 20, 21, whatever. Hey, if you failed the quiz, maybe time to start readdressing and knocking off those bullet items that you can control right now. Focus your mind on those things versus what you can't control.
Mr. Janich, closing thoughts?
I think what it comes down to is, as we always say, think for yourself. As we were sitting here, I was getting emails from my day job at Spyderco, and they're saying, hey, we're looking toward being able to kind of normalize things, start having people come back into the office. We need to try to kind of figure out a schedule and everything else. I think one of the dangerous things at this point is people are so anxious to jump back in and try to achieve some degree of normalcy or something like that, or they're trying to follow what everyone else does and say, okay, well, so-and-so is doing this, so I'm going to jump in as well. Again, think for yourself. We're all in individual situations. We all have individual risks. We all have individual concerns. And we also, because this has been such an anxiety-ridden experience, think about that aspect of it too and say, okay, for example, my wife, her gym, they contacted her and said, hey, we're probably going to be opening up. We're going to implement these procedures and we're going to do these things and everything. She read through all that. She's like, it's great that they're doing all that kind of stuff, but I'm still not comfortable with it. I'm not going back yet. So what I would recommend is think for yourself. We talk about risks. Think about that risk management as it applies to you, as it applies to your loved ones, and keep applying the basics. We still don't have all the answers. So don't just, again, say, hey, things are going back to normal. I need to jump back in. Think about creating your new normal on your terms.
Very good. Very well spoken. Dr. April, closing thoughts for the week.
I would encourage people to be good consumers of solutions. That if you hear a simple solution, all we need to do is, my bias is to believe at this point that that person is either lying to me or lying to themselves. It took us a long time to get into the woods, and it's going to take us a long, thoughtful time to get out. So I think be a good consumer of what's offered as a solution.
Mr. Pincus, closing words.
Try to leave the politics aside. Try to really think objectively and critically about the information you're taking in. At the very least, don't let your information come solely from, one political view or another. We know what they are. We know the alignment of the major news agencies and things like that. Try to really get as objective as you can about your information, and don't politicize your actions. Think about your medical issues. Think about your social responsibilities to your family, to your community, the people you're going to be interacting with at work, or the people that you live with at home when you come back from going back out into the world. I think that responsibility, I think the ultimate expression of freedom is the responsibility that comes with taking action and not blaming it on somebody else, or not just following what somebody else is telling you so that you can say, well, I was doing what he said, or I'm not doing what they said because I'm going to show them how free I am. Be free to be responsible.
Very well said. And if I could close a little bit of a slight political note, but along the same lines, Rob. I've often found that Alexander Solzhenitsyn's writings are very compelling when they talk about freedom. And of course, his classic quote from the Gulag Archipelago is that how they all burned in the camps thinking of what it would have been like if they had fought back against Stalin's people. But I always like kind of the closing line of that quote, which is, it was, as they're talking there, if. But we didn't love freedom enough. And even more, we had no awareness of what the real situation was. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterwards. As we move forward into a very new world, we have to remember both our roots and at the same time that it is going to be a new world, and we're going to have to find our way through it. Once again, thank you, Mr. Sieklander, Mr. Janich, Mr. Pincus somewhere in the car, Toddler Pincus, thank you very much for joining in. Dr. April, I'm Michael Bain. This is The Best Defense Survival, and we will see you next week.